Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's event. We are calling the North Korea Forecast for 2021, a former national intelligence officer's view. I'm really grateful to the Clements and Strauss Centers and the Intelligence Studies Project for sponsoring this event, and really pleased that we have a wonderful guest to be able to share his expertise with all of you this afternoon. North Korea is often described as unpredictable, and even experienced intelligence analysts refer to it as a hard target. Today, we have with us former National Intelligence Officer Markus Garlauskas, who is going to explain the analytic tradecraft that can be used to meet these difficult challenges of making strategic level forecasts of North Korean behavior. And he's going to base his remarks on nearly 2 decades of experience in government focused on analyzing North Korea at the US National Intelligence Council and in the headquarters of US Forces Korea. He led the intelligence community's strategic analysis on North Korea as the National Intelligence Officer for North Korea from July 2014 through June of 2020. And before his appointment at NIO, he served in Seoul at the US Forces Korea headquarters for nearly 12 years in a variety of key positions, including as the Chief of Intelligence Estimates and Director of Strategy. Following the conclusion of his government appointment, as a member of the Senior National Intelligence Service, he joined the Scrowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council as a non-resident senior fellow affiliated with the Asia Strategy Initiative. He earned a master's degree from Georgetown University and now teaches a class on strategic analysis of North Korea there, and also tweets a really highly educational amount of information at his Twitter feed, which is posted on our event webpage. So today he's going to explain a little bit more about the analytic tradecraft with which government officials try to understand and forecast what's ahead for North Korea. And then he's going to apply this method to offer his own forecast for North Korea in 2021, along with some discussion of various scenarios for potential US policy and strategy. He's also really generously offered to talk about a bit about intelligence-related careers for any students or other folks who are listening who might be interested in that, and we can cover that in the Q&A. If you have questions as we go along, please do put them into us using the Q&A function in Zoom. And with that, what I'm going to do is to start by asking Markus to take 15 or 20 minutes to lay out some initial thoughts on where North Korea is at and what we might expect in terms of its approach to 2021. Markus, I'm sorry that we couldn't welcome you to Austin in person, but I really am grateful, and we're all very glad that you're able to join us for this virtual event. So thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. And yes, I hope to be there in person at some point, especially considering how the weather is right now in McLean. I wouldn't mind being there. Welcome everyone to my study. I'm looking forward to this conversation, and I want to thank Sheena and the whole team at UT, Strauss, Intelligence Studies Project, and the Clements Center for this chance. I want to emphasize up front, as Sheena mentioned, even though I am a former government official, what I'm going to explain doesn't imply any endorsement by the ODNI, by the intelligence community, or by any element of the US government. These are just my views. So I think it's important for me to sort of begin the story to help you understand where things are headed with North Korea, to tell you a little bit about my own story. So I started my first assignment in Korea in the intelligence estimates branch in the headquarters there. And this was exactly where I wanted to be. This was part of the organization that supported the military plans, policies, exercises, and strategy. And we focused on what was called estimative intelligence. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as I explain the methodology. But basically, this is the type of intelligence that's focused on the future, focused on probabilities rather than certainties. And so basically, when you're doing estimative intelligence, you're living in a hypothetical world based in the real world, but your thinking, your analysis is based on possibilities, again, rather than probabilities. Another big thing that we focused on in the estimates shop, and that is useful for estimative intelligence in general, is the idea of red teaming. And so some of the things I'm going to explain today require you to try and understand North Korea's mindset. I think there's a tendency a lot of times to think about how we look at a country's behavior or an individual's behavior from a perspective of what would we do if we were in their shoes. And that's better than thinking about what you would like them to do or viewing them completely externally. But you're still transplanting your own mindset, your own biases, your own thinking into that other person, into that other entity. So it's very important. And one of the things that we tried to focus on was viewing what we call through the red lens, see things that, in this case, the way the adversary sees them, understand their own mindset, their sources of information, and their background. So that was a foundational experience for me. Then now another big learning experience in terms of forecasting the future and how it affected my thinking about methodology is the move I made from estimates to the strategy shop. So I was chief of estimates for 3 years by the time I finished up in that organization, and I moved to strategy. And there I really took a more international view of looking at the future of the Korean Peninsula and across all the elements of power, not just the military focus. So I had a chance to work with officers from the United Nations Command, from all the different sending states that support the defense of Korea, including the ones that fought alongside the U.S. and South Korea in the Korean War. I got a chance to work even more closely with South Korean counterparts, and then also to work with people from all across the interagency. And I think it's key when you look at estimating, you have to do it in a very interdisciplinary way. You have to think about the full range of elements of national power, the full range of effects of the international community, and again, really understand the cultural and organizational mindsets of the organizations that you're trying to anticipate the behavior of. And this was all great preparation for me to come back to be the National Intelligence Officer, where I spent almost 6 years supporting the top level leaders in the United States with estimative and other types of intelligence on North Korea, and spent a lot of time focusing on what we call tradecraft, the different methods, the skills, the techniques involved in analysis, particularly estimative tradecraft, which the National Intelligence Council is well known for. You may have heard of the NICS Global Trends Report, which is about as estimate as you can get. It looks globally at the full range of potential issues that could affect U.S. national security, and it looks decades out. And so this opportunity at the NIC gave me a chance to think about methodology and to see a little bit about what works and doesn't work in terms of informing decision making. And in that experience, I really came to think about two particular schools of thought as really being key for estimating and forecasting the future. And they're basically epitomized, one by Sherman Kent and the traditional, I would say, well, traditional sounds pejorative, but the process that the intelligence community has used for a long time to do estimative intelligence. And certainly the National Intelligence Council has used this approach because Sherman Kent was one of the founders of the intelligence analysis techniques, again, that were used by the U.S. intelligence community even before the National Intelligence Council came into place. And then the second philosophy is that of Phil Tetlock and his Good Judgment Project, which he explained in the best-selling book Super Forecasting. So I'm not going to go into great depth on these because I know we want to get to okay, so what's going to happen with North Korea? So I'll just say with Sherman Kent, he begins with the idea of intellectual humility. And you'll hear this in my estimate as I go forward. Estimating is what we do when we do not know, is what Sherman Kent said. He also recognized that estimative intelligence has to have a certain degree of a narrative. It's not enough just to be right, but it also has to make sense. It has to be compelling to the audience, which again requires you to explain in terms that the audience can understand how the adversary, how the country that you're looking at, how the leader that you're looking at sees the world. And you have to be able to explain that narrative. His idea of building an estimate was to approach it like building a pyramid. You start with the foundational information, you start with the facts of the matter, and then you gradually build additional assessments. And in some cases, you have to make assumptions to fill in the pieces until you get to the very point. And the point is where you're actually providing the estimate that looks far enough into the future that it can be useful to inform decision-making, and that includes very useful ideas, answers to questions that are going to be of relevance to the policymaker. You can't just stop short and say, here's what we think is going to happen, and not explain the why and the how that can allow the decision maker to affect it. But in essence, his idea is you start with deep knowledge, then you build credible analysis on top of that, avoiding bias as much as possible, and then you finish with impactful analysis. In contrast to Kent, Phil Tetlock's approach is more mathematical and probabilistic, and it's much more focused on specifics. And so even though Tetlock is even more focused, I would argue, on avoiding bias than Sherman Kent is, he approaches it in a very different way. The idea is to train the mind of a forecaster rather than to build the product of an estimate. And he focuses not so much on depth of knowledge. As a matter of fact, his idea of an ideal super forecaster is someone who actually doesn't necessarily have a whole lot of depth or history on the subject that they're estimating. And so his methodology focuses on breaking a forecast down into discrete and time-limited yes or no questions that are very specific, but again, are going to be relevant to decision makers. So there's some overlap there with Kent. But he's going to focus on, in his thinking and his approach, on issues like, will North Korea launch a particular type of missile before a certain date, which can be answered yes or no. You can assign a probability to it. And this allows a super forecaster then to learn from this sort of experience and see, when they were right and when they were wrong, because a yes or no question is very concrete, right? The problem is when you get to this sort of approach, even if you can train a super forecaster much more accurate in their percentages, how do those numbers really inform decision making? How do they really explain the narrative of how an adversary sees the situation? And then, of course, how can they actually help decision makers have an impact? And so I think, although that sort of very specific technique is useful, in the end, I find Sherman Kent's approach more compelling. And ultimately, the paradox is that if you do really good estimate of intelligence, you could have such an impact that it could turn out to be wrong, right? Because if you warn somebody that, hey, if you walk outside, you're going to get wet, of course, being that, hey, maybe it's going to rain, if that person picks up an umbrella, they're going to prove your estimate wrong. They're not going to get wet, right? And that's an oversimplified example, but it does show you that as the estimate of methodology advances, you definitely, and you have impact, you definitely have the potential then to actually affect the situation so much that your original estimate becomes incorrect. So I've spent about half of my time now talking about methodology, so let's just dive right in on North Korea. I think a good place to start thinking about this year and even about the next few years is with understanding the North Korea's perspective that came out of the Party Congress. These events now under Kim Jong-un take place every 5 years, and they're Kim Jong-un's opportunity, the party leader's opportunity, to disseminate his guidance to all of the senior leaders within North Korea, and then also be able to have them work out all of the details as much as they can anyway at the Party Congress of how are they going to execute this guidance over the coming 5 years. This is something that Kim Jong-un himself reinvigorated after he assumed power, because his father actually discontinued the practice and proposed or approached it in a much more personalized method of rule rather than relying on the party. So this Party Congress, even though it was scheduled to take place this year, Kim Jong-un was able to essentially choose the date. And he chose to execute this 8th Party Congress just prior to the inauguration of the US president. So in my view, looking at it logically, there were certainly, of course, other reasons that were potentially involved in setting that date, but he knew full well, Kim Jong-un, that he was going to be disseminating the results of the Party Congress prior to the US president taking office. So that essentially he was taking the first move, locking in an approach and disseminating it to his own leadership and to the world about what North Korea's objectives and focus were going to be. And so I think that's key to emphasize that Kim sees himself as wanting to drive the agenda rather than in a position where he's going to react to President Biden. So that's really what I expect to see from Kim Jong-un in the coming year, and of course we can see it out to the whole 5-year range of what that Party Congress was planned to cover. Another big element to keep in mind out of this Party Congress that's going to affect the coming year is how Kim Jong-un is continuing to institutionalize and refine the Korean Workers' Party mechanisms for running the country under his leadership. Even though he's maintaining control, even though he's very much centralized power, he's not elevating the authority of his sister, for example, as it had been speculated, and he doesn't seem to be in a mode where he's trying to preserve a great degree of agility. When you look at his father, part of the value of having putting a suspension on the Party Congress and holding information so close is it gave Kim Jong-il, again Kim Jong-un's father, the ability to very quickly change direction, and he didn't have to explain himself, whereas Kim Jong-un is really explaining in great depth where he wants to go, but it means it's a very costly signal, right? Kim Jong-un can't as easily change direction as his father could without then having to educate his entire leadership again on the fundamental changes in plan. And so I don't think he's constrained nearly as much as a Democratic leader. He's constrained himself through these very costly signals at the party Congress. And I think the most important costly signal to understand is underappreciated, and that is that it's a good sign of where Kim intends to go. That in some ways, I guess, a bad sign, but a useful sign. The fact that he seems to be preparing the party for enduring economic hardship and isolation. He doesn't appear to be either desperate nor positioning himself for any sort of sanctions relief, like you saw some of those messages from Kim a few years ago when there had been this apparent breakthrough in diplomacy. And so this means that Kim Jong-un is not planning on behaving in ways that are necessarily going to be conducive to meeting the conditions that the United States and South Korea and other countries in the world are going to want to see met in order to lift the sanctions on North Korea, in order to normalize the relationship, in order to end the isolation of North Korea. Kim is set on an approach where he knows there's a very good chance he won't get the sanctions relief that he would ideally prefer, and instead he's preparing the North Korean system to be able to deal without that relief and while being isolated. Another very important element is the way he laid out at this party Congress the range of very specific capabilities that North Korea is either developing or will soon develop over the course of this plan that he's laid out for the next 5 years. He doesn't give us exact milestones, but he does talk very specifically, Kim Jong-un, in his reports back to the party Congress, which are covered by North Korean state media very publicly. He covers things like developing tactical nuclear weapons, the fact that North Korea has made preparations for multiple warhead missiles, for solid fuel ICBMs, and many other very specific developments, even outside of the purely nuclear and missile realm, including unmanned aerial vehicles. And so all these capabilities, again, are a costly signal that he's putting focus on these various systems that are going to advance North Korea's actual capability, but also are signaling that North Korea is not going to restrain itself. It's not going to back down when it comes to developing these sorts of, when it comes to developing the strategic weapon systems that are of greatest concern to South Korea and the United States. So what does this mean? It means that our expectations should be fairly low in terms of what we can accomplish with diplomacy vis-a-vis North Korea. And it means that because Kim Jong-un doesn't seem to be in a position where he's expecting or needing sanctions relief to make it through the next 5 years, that's not going to be a huge constraint on his behavior. And because he's committing to further developing these capabilities, it means that if you're going to look at diplomatic approaches to North Korea that might be able to have traction, the possibility is more that Kim might be willing to scale back or slow down or even push off some of the items that they said that haven't made very much progress. So things that are still in their early stages, whereas the things that he's committed to taking to the next step may be much harder because he's already sunk a lot of resources into them, and also because of the immediate value that he can get out of testing or advancing some of these systems. So that's the broad picture. Essentially, you see Kim Jong-un that's committed to a course of action that intends to see the Biden administration react to him rather than the other way around, is committed to pushing through despite the challenges of isolation and sanctions, and committed to advancing North Korea's capabilities because he clearly is not satisfied that they are yet at the point where he would like them to be. And so that's going to be helpful to a decision maker, hopefully. But how does this really then translate into what we expect to see in the next year? And so I'll move a little bit into Tetlock's territory and start talking about some specific events that we might see. And also start talking about other approaches other than those that are based in the perspective of the party Congress. So certainly there's been a lot of commentary about the desire that Kim might have to get the Biden administration's attention. I think when you really look at North Korea's history, their focus is not on getting attention. I think that's more of a caricature of North Korea, but they conduct weapons tests and they do provocative activities to achieve particular political goals, not just to get attention for the sake of attention. That's a very, I think, very insulting caricature in some ways to North Korea. It's not just a cry for attention from North Korea when they conduct these sorts of activities. There's also some commentators that they're sort of viewing it much more in the space of what can be impacted, and so you see some optimism that that North Korea is going to engage, it's going to lean forward, it's going to be willing to restrain itself. And I think there's an over optimism there on the part of what can be accomplished through diplomacy, what can be accomplished through engagement with North Korea in the near term. I don't see any signs that North Korea intends to go on a track toward denuclearization, and so I think there's going to be some real limitations there, and what you're going to see that could be accomplished, no matter what the efforts are by the Biden administration and by the Moon administration toward North Korea. And so if North Korea is not facing a truly dire economic situation, despite the challenges they're having, that Kim is intent on pushing through, then it seems more likely that he's going to be willing to risk some degree of confrontation to advance those goals that we just talked about. And certainly, it seems like everything is designed by Kim to try and wear down the resistance of the international community to accepting him de facto as a nuclear armed state. And so that points to signs of potential weapons testing that we would see this year. So there's been a lot of focus on the potential for an ICBM launch and this monster missile. I wrote about it. You can see a picture of it here behind me. But to go back to Tetlock's approach, I think the probability of this coming first is pretty low when you look at it in an unbiased way. The payoff versus the risk, looking at it from Kim Jong-un's perspective and looking at all the other variables involved, I think that's pretty unlikely. But what we could see, and what we are more likely to see, is tests of shorter range weapon systems, of systems of more limited capability, certainly systems with solid fuel, and we can talk in the Q&A a little bit more about why that matters. But systems that historically have not, in the last few years at least, tripped the threshold of leading to a major international response, but things that still, of course, advance North Korea's capability. And so I think, although Kim has set his overall strategic path, tactically he's flexible. And I think based on some initial probes, whether it's through diplomacy, whether it's through statements, whether it's through the things that he has displayed, like back in January, and seeing how the reactions go, I think we may see some tactical adjustments in North Korea's approach. But I think the strategic path for 2021 and through the next few years has been set, and there's not a lot that we can do to fundamentally change it. It's a matter of what is going to be the ability to restrain North Korea's testing and potentially engage them, provide them with incentives, and potentially implicit threats to the point where Kim decides that proceeding with weapons testing to the point of an ICBM test, or even proceeding with any weapons testing at all, ideally, will be just too risky in terms of the challenges it's going to pose to his regime and to his overall goals. And so I think when you look at the impact that sort of assessment might have from our perspective, of course, it doesn't. It isn't a really great news story, right? There's no silver bullet. There's no perfect combination of incentives and punishments that can get North Korea to do what we would want it to do. But I think that's accepting reality as it is, that Kim Jong-un is on a path to continue to advance his capabilities. And the best we can do at this point, in the near term anyway, is hope to slow it. Maybe longer term, we can talk beyond just the next year or so on the Q&A about things that we could do that might change the incentives and change Kim's longer term plan, or even be something that could change calculus after Kim Jong-un leaves the scene. But in the end, I think the path for 2021, even if we don't know, again, exactly tactically, specifically what North Korea is going to test and when they're going to test it, I do expect to see some probing, some pushing of the envelope, and continued advancement of North Korea's weapons program within hopefully some degree of constraints that will be able to convince North Korea to operate. So that's my view on what we're going to see in terms of the North Korean forecast. So it's cloudy with a chance of rain, but I don't see a big thunderstorm coming yet.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I can see a couple of questions coming in, and if you could, rather than raise your hand, go ahead and put your question into the Q&A. That'll give us a chance to combine questions where there's overlap and try to cover as many as possible. Before we turn to some of the questions coming in, I wanted to actually just follow up a little bit on your comment about missile development, and particularly the missile that is in the photo over your shoulder. And, you know, in rereading the piece that you wrote over the weekend for the National Interest, you talk about how the Pukgoksong 5, which is North Korea's new solid fuel submarine launched ballistic missile, is an issue not just on its own, right? Not because of the submarine launched part, which kind of tends to get more of the attention, or has recently, but actually for what it says about where the overall missile program might be headed, and that it's more concerning in some ways for what it tells us about, you know, a long-range ICBM, about multiple reentry vehicles on a North Korean missile. So I wanted to ask, you know, and the fact that solid fuel missiles require less prep time, so they're easier to launch fast and harder to take out in the fueling process, which makes North Korea's overall arsenal more survivable. So for those of you who haven't read the piece, it's great. It's a really helpful, you know, encapsulation of where North Korea is at, and I'll try to put a link in the chat momentarily. But I wanted to ask you if you could just tell us a little bit more about the arguments you make in that piece, and what is it that, you know, is concerning about that development, and what kind of a test you think we might see as a next step toward moving the ball down the field there.
She gave a great summary of a lot of the key points in the article already, but I'll try and add a little value here and look at some different aspects that I talked about in the article that may be important. So I think one thing that's really key overall is tying the display of this missile to some of the same topics that Kim Jong-un discussed in the Party Congress. And so one of the things that I pointed out is that when you look at the size of the missile, when you look at the configuration of the payload shroud on the top, it indicates the real potential for this to have multiple reentry vehicles, essentially to be able to fire multiple warheads at once. And the fact that Kim Jong-un mentions that in the Party Congress and then displays this missile that looks very much like a US 1960s era submarine launched ballistic missile of a type that had three reentry vehicles. I think that means it's not just a capability that he's advancing, but I think it's also a signal that Kim is trying to show us that he's serious. Now, the big question is this thing ready for testing? You know, I hear jokes about it being a paper and mache mock-up. You know, I'm not going to pretend to try and get into a cross section of where this missile is actually at, but the fact that it's being displayed shows that Kim is trying to make progress in that area. And certainly, given the fact that North Korea was able to test an SLBM in 2019 and not really have any significant international consequences, talks even went forward after North Korea tested this missile. It says to me that Kim may think this is something he could test and not really suffer significant international repercussions, or that those repercussions would if they came from the United States, would leave the US sort of isolated, where the Chinese and maybe even South Korea would say, hey, this is not worth blowing up the chances, so to speak, of diplomacy just because they test this thing. So I think the fact that it fits below sort of the threshold of what has recently been considered to be beyond the quote unquote red line, that it has the ability potentially to loft multiple warheads, and that it is, again, looks to be a solid fuel system, which is something that we know, again, Kim has said long-term he wants to have a solid fuel ICBM capability, and it is a large diameter. So this could be the basis then for a solid fuel ICBM capability, which is a concern for all the reasons that you point out, Sheena. So I think the fact is that this might be sort of the perfect system for Kim to not just test capability, but also test the will of the international community of how focused are we really on holding North Korea to account for strategic weapons testing. Is this something essentially that he can make some progress, but then avoid a whole lot of strong reaction? That's why I'm particularly concerned now that this system has been displayed so prominently.
So I see a question that's related to this in the Q&A, which is from Ken Anderson, about, you know, would a test of an ICBM then be more risky for North Korea than tests of other, you know, than some of the other tests they could run? And if so, what is it about? Why might why might he not understand that? Which is I think what you said a minute ago. Did I hear that correctly? And how does would an ICBM test be more risky for North Korea than other kinds of testing? And do you think North Korea understands that? If so,
sure, yeah. So I mean, to be clear, no, I think North Korea understands that once you go beyond a certain point and you start testing ICBMs or maybe even intermediate range missiles, when you look at the reactions that we saw in 2017 and even in 2016 to firing missiles, attempting to launch missiles at that range, the international community did have some pretty significant reactions, and then even China was willing to sign on to UN Security Council resolutions that condemned North Korean actions and that had brought into play and I don't like to use the word unprecedented, but truly unprecedented new sanctions against North Korea. And so clearly going to the point of an ICBM, I think Kim does understand, to be clear, that there is an additional level of risk involved, and that would be the reason to start with something that advances toward an ICBM and then maybe develops capabilities and technologies that would be helpful for an ICBM, but not go right to an ICBM off the bat. I'm not saying that I would rule that out entirely, but I think a test of something before testing an ICBM, from the approach that Kim has taken in the past and from trying to view it through Kim Jong-un's lens as best we can, I think a test of something else before the ICBM makes sense to gauge what the international reactions are going to be, and maybe even get an international reaction that makes him more confident that then he could proceed to ICBM testing if he's technically at the point where he wants to do it.
Thanks. That's really helpful. That's great and helps me understand a little bit more, what's at stake on both sides of the perceptions and calculations here. I'm seeing a couple of different questions in the chat from people about the China factor. And one thing that's interesting is that in the past, a lot of United States approach was pretty heavily focused on trying to get China to pressure North Korea or to get China to influence North Korean behavior. And I'm seeing a number of questions here about, will China actually try to do that? What's China's interest in North Korean behavior here? And if so, how responsive is North Korea likely to be to what China wants anyway?
Yeah, so I mean, I've been on the record many times pointing out that China rhetoric about its focus on denuclearization and what it says sometimes to the United States or U.S. audiences is not actually matched by action. And then in particular, since 2018, when the North Koreans pivoted to diplomacy, the Chinese do not seem particularly focused on applying continued pressure to North Korea. They, as opposed to maximum pressure, the Chinese have been sort of in minimal acceptable pressure level to just try and restrain North Korea to a degree, but not really trying to apply a level of pressure that would in any fundamental way change their calculus. I'm particularly concerned about the fact that China right now, because of its relationship with the United States having deteriorated and because of I think the common understanding now that we're much more in a mode where we're going to be competing, maybe even confronting China, competing with and confronting China, that it means that it may be less and less in China's interest in their minds to do much to really cooperate with the United States on North Korea. I've heard some people remark that I respect very much that 2017 was essentially a kind of an anomaly because of all of these factors that lined up between North Korean bad behavior, the Chinese interest in potentially getting a good reaction out of the new administration and things like a new trade agreement or a new understanding on trade, and so as a result. You're not going to see us be able to go back to that moment of 2017 again, where China was willing to sign on to new sanctions. They're not even willing to enforce the sanctions that they agreed to back in 2017, of course. And so even though they want to restrain North Korea, they don't want to see a conflict in the peninsula. I certainly think they don't want to see nuclear testing. It's an open question of how far will China go to actually restrain North Korea from resuming missile testing, particularly given again, in 2019 and 2020, North Korea conducted a pretty good number of missile tests, and China was quite happy to sit on the sidelines. To be fair, Washington didn't exactly react strongly either. But I do think that we should not view China's behavior in 2017 as necessarily a precursor of what's to come, because we are in a different situation. Because again, North Korea has pivoted to diplomacy. They've been, Xi and Kim have engaged. They've had summits. We see again a deterioration in the relationship between the U.S. and China, and then we see North Korea sort of successfully, gradually having pushed the envelope of what it can get away with. So I'm pessimistic about China being able to restrain North Korea too much, even if it will certainly exercise some degree of restraint on North.
I remember I visited North Korea with a group of scholars in 2012, and the sort of latent animosity toward dependence on China, if not China itself, was actually quite noticeable, right? It was not very far below the surface on a number of occasions, and that was interesting, because it was a facet of the relationship that I hadn't quite fully appreciated until then. I'm seeing a question here that I wanted to raise about, well, I'll just read the question because I think it's very well worded. As a veteran of East Germany in 1989, I'm always keen to assess regime stability and prospects for sudden unforeseen change. Can you tell us about a scenario that, once triggered, could cause the DPRK to collapse and generate a regional security crisis? So
Sure.
Kind of prospects for stability, are there fault lines? What's a scenario where change might be unexpected?
Yeah, I mean, I think, many have focused on this, and I think it's a fair one to focus on, is something that is starts with the hesitation of Kim Jong-un, perhaps for a medical reason, accident, a lone wolf assassin, something like that, where Kim Jong-un leaves the scene. The system is not designed to function without a supreme leader, right? And so the question is, who's going to be the next supreme leader? And I think it's in debate right now who that would be. I really reject the hypothesis that it is Kim Yo-jong. All the signs do not point to her being prepared to be the successor. Might she emerge victorious in a power struggle? Oh, sure, can't rule that out. But in the end, there is no one being prepared to succeed Kim Jong-un at this point, probably because he intends to live a lot longer and will want to have one of his offspring rather than his sister be his successor. And so if you start with that as a premise, you remove Kim Jong-un from the equation, it's hard to see how things run real well for a long time without another leader being put in that position, and that leader dealing with those challenges and consolidating their own control and their own position in the system. I think that's the single most likely way that things could unravel in North Korea. I mean, are there other scenarios? Sure. But I think also we have a tendency to view the situation in the Cold War in East and West Germany as a model. And I think it's not a bad point of reference, but there are a lot of variables that are critically different, including the fact that you don't have a South Korea that is interested in absorbing North Korea right now, right? West Germany had laws and procedures and mechanisms in place so that they could absorb the economic shock, and even then the shock was overwhelming, right? It did some harm, but they had programs and laws in place in the event of reunification, and certainly East German officials knew that. I think North Korean officials are probably more worried about their own personal, their own safety and being able to stay away from either being executed or prison in the event of the collapse of North Korea. So there's a lot of incentive for the North Korean elites to hang together, whereas I think in the German scenario, it was quite the opposite. There were a lot of incentives for East German officials to just sort of go along and reunify in a West German-led Germany. So I think that's a big variable. There's a lot of incentives for the elites to hang together. So I think sort of the more kind of middle management or grassroots level sort of push is not going to be the major factor for bringing down the regime. I don't expect that unless Kim were to make a huge miscalculation in how he handles things. But I think you remove Kim Jong-un from the scene, and then that could destabilize the system definitely.
That's fascinating. And it is interesting to think about differences from 1989. I've looked a little bit at China's response to 1989 and how it tried to chart a path that would avoid those mistakes, which is something that all evidence indicates Xi Jinping has looked at quite carefully and is really concerned about. So it's an interesting question to think about what learning process might have taken place in North Korea, or what, lessons they might have drawn from that. I wanted to stay with this question of, regime stability, and in particular the elite dynamics, for a minute. One of the questions in the chat talks about a number of North Korean diplomats that have defected over the years, and in particular a couple of high-level defections, one of which I think just became public quite recently, from 2019 or 2020. And the question in the chat has to do with whether or not they were cooperating with US intelligence while they were serving as diplomats. I realize you may not be able to answer that. So what I wanted to do is put that on the table, but also give you kind of an alternate question about these elite defections, which is, how do you assess developments like that in terms of, what is the potential for elite defection to be a problem for North Korea? Under what circumstances, would elite defections actually rise to a level where that might affect stability? And are we anywhere close, or are these, people who are still kind of external and low level enough that their absence doesn't create a crack in the ruling foundation? How should we be thinking about that?
Yeah, so I think the key thing to keep, I mean, obviously I'm not going to answer any operational questions, no comment on any of that, but I think the key thing to keep in mind with defections is where in the regime hierarchy, if you're talking about elite defections, these people are located and what role they have. And I don't want to denigrate the importance of the people that have come out of the foreign ministry and have made the courageous decision to stand against the North Korean regime. But I think the evidence is pretty clear that the foreign ministry is not at the center of North Korean decision-making. And so although they have exposure to the outside world, they're clearly involved in the democratic process. I mean, I think the literature out there on North Korean regime decision-making, as imperfect as the understanding may be, is pretty clear. The foreign ministry is not a center of power in North Korea. So on the contrary, however, Bob Collins and others have written about the importance of the organizational guidance department. So there's an example of an organization that is really key in the North Korean elite power structure. And so if you see senior officials from the OGD defecting, then I would start to wonder about the stability of the North Korean regime. If you had senior officials from the security services, from the military, if you had generals defecting, okay, then this would be a sign that there's really something is coming unraveled. But when you have diplomats, I'm sure that Kim's not happy about it, but to me, it doesn't point to some sort of fundamental, a system, issue where the regime is about to unravel just because they're losing diplomats from the foreign ministry. I think that we got to be careful to not to underestimate. Certainly it's significant, but also not to exaggerate the implications for regime stability.
Okay, great. I wanted to ask a question that has come up about something that Kim Jong-un did in January at the Party Congress, and something that he did in one of his public speeches last year, which was to essentially admit some degree of failure. And to some extent that was directed at lower levels of the North Korean political system, and blame certain officials for failing to get things right or do their duty. But he also, there were reports that he expressed sadness about the economic state of North Korea, about the fact that the economic goals that had been laid out hadn't been met, and that the fact that had imposed hardship on citizens. And I realize we're getting into the realm of mind reading here to ask you to think about, what Kim Jong-un is doing there. But as a close observer of the leadership, how do you, how would we know if this was strategic? Right? This is an attempt to deflect blame, to, get citizens on board, like you talked about, for potential hardship ahead, because that's what he anticipates. How much of this is about, recognizing that elites are, maybe not as comfortable as they were because of some of the economic pressures imposed by COVID? How do we think about this more emotional acknowledgement that we seem to be getting from Kim Jong-un, and that's very different from his father, for example? And what would you make of that?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head by the reference to his father. I mean, Kim Jong-un has such a fundamentally different leadership style in many ways than Kim Jong-il. I mean, even though he runs the same regime, a regime that was bequeathed to him by his father, his approach to how he runs it and how he interacts with the population, how he interacts with the public is in many ways fundamentally different. So we've seen these signs, and there's articles in the media, actually in the Western media, about how Kim is giving guidance that he does not want to be portrayed in these exaggerated terms. He wants the news in North Korea to be more realistic about him. And so it's still, of course, incredibly laudatory, but I think you do definitely see that Kim is trying to basically bring things a little bit more down to earth. And he wants to be seen as someone who has a greater connection to the people, someone who's not isolated and to the people in general, but also to the needs and the interests of the North Korean elite. And so I hate to be so negative, but I really do think it's a tactic. I think it's a very natural sort of a political approach on the part of a leader who, although ultimately he doesn't have to be responsive like a democratic leader, he still has to recognize that he's got to lead people, and he's got to deal with their emotions and their beliefs and their ideas and shape them to achieve his goals, right, and to prevent a challenge to his leadership, right. And so I think the recognition of the fact that the party did not achieve its goals, the recognition of the fact that there is a great deal of hardship in North Korea, I think those are elements of Kim Jong-un's leadership style. I think they fit with his pattern of recent years, and I think they're a natural extension of it. I actually have a piece that's going to be coming out on this. And sort of my thinking on this is sort of Kim Jong-un's use and misuse of apologies, right? Sorry, not sorry, is in essence what Kim is saying. When you look at the way the speeches read, he's very perturbed and upset in the way he presents emotionally about, like he did in October, to the point of purportedly tears about the suffering of the North Korean people. But in the end, he's not accepting the blame personally. He feels, and he's communicating a sense of responsibility, but not that it's necessarily his, truly his fault, right? Is that he feels for the North Korean people, but in the end, COVID, the United States, other factors, and failures of subordinate officials are the proximal reasons why the North Korean people are suffering. And he just, is trying to convey his desire to ease that suffering as much as he can, but gird them that the suffering will continue, again, because North Korea is on a path where they have to push through, because in the end, they're not going to trade their nuclear weapons to get some economic relief, right? And so to go back to where we started, though, I really do think that it is so markedly different from Kim Jong-il, because Kim Jong-un is a different person, but also because he's chosen to take for very rational reasons, a different approach to how he deals with these issues when there's a failure, when there's a shortcoming, and to really force the party to deal with it and to examine it, and really to make it clear that he's not pretending that these problems don't exist. He's acknowledging them. And just basically trying to reframe the reasons for these problems and the suffering, rather than pretend the problems don't exist. It's actually, when you think about it, a much more effective way to deal with the permeation of information into North Korean society, and sort of a more modern way to rule, rather than pretending that reality is different. Is just reframe why that reality is the way it is. And what it means for the North Korean elite and for the North Korean population. I think that's what he's trying to do.
Kind of an interesting way to flip the script then, and scapegoating that might actually have a shot at reinforcing him as a moral or a legitimate leader. At least that might be the intent.
Sure.
That actually leads me to one of the questions. There are two related questions in the chat about how North Korea might respond to potential outreach from the new U.S. administration. And so one question just has to do with what incentives could actually be given to North Korea that might be interesting to them enough to slow or halt testing. Not necessarily go all the way toward full disarmament, as you mentioned, but is there something that the US could offer that would actually be appealing to North Korea enough for them even to really pause on these goals that Kim Jong-un has laid out? And does that mean, should the Biden administration try to open up dialogue? Because the Trump administration, one of the things that they note is, look, while we were talking, they weren't doing as much testing. And it was when the talking stopped that they picked testing back up. So is it worth it then to try to start some dialogue? And if so, what could the US put on the table that might interest North Korea?
So I think we've reached the point where, in some sense, dialogue is not that big of a concession by the United States, but also, unfortunately, it may not be seen as terribly valuable by North Korea. So I don't think dialogue alone and the prospects for dialogue in particular are going to be sufficient to really change the calculus of the regime about testing over any sort of extended period of time. As I pointed out, back in 2019, they accepted talks and launched an SLBM, I think, within hours of each other, if I remember right. And so I think it's going to take some tangible incentives. And I think the art of the possible, though, ultimately can only be determined by the Biden administration, given the options that they have available and what they're willing to offer. But I think to get to that point, you have to obviously have some sort of conversation with the North Koreans. You don't want to engage in what we call negotiating with yourself, and then figuring out what it is that you're willing to give, to the point where you give too much, or you give something that isn't going to be sufficient to the goal, right? You have to get a sense of what North Korea's price is, right? A better sense, recognizing that this is not going to be something that would be a permanent state of affairs, and recognizing, of course, that it isn't going to fundamentally signal a change in North Korea's commitment toward its program. And I think this is a mindset that's difficult for a lot of Americans to get into. I mean, are we going to pay off essentially an adversary? Are we going to bribe them? Are we going to pay protection money? Are we going to engage in appeasement? But this is not Nazi Germany in the 1930s. North Korea is in a different strategic situation, and we're in a different strategigic situation. And so, even though there's some comparison that can be made in terms of the terrible nature of the North Korean regime and how it treats its people, in the end, the strategic situation is different. And we're not talking about giving up the control of sovereign states in North Korea. We're talking about potentially easing some of the pressure, providing some economic incentives, maybe opening new avenues of engagement that might be of interest to them, and these sorts of things. And one of the problematic things, though, is going to be, what are the North Koreans going to demand in terms of military posture and exercises? And I think this is one of the places where we're going to have a very tough conversation to deal with about what are we going to be willing to do in terms of calibrating exercises. We have scaled them back so much. I don't think ending them is in the interests of the United States or the alliance. I don't think it's practical. I don't think there's a way to ever satisfy North Korea in this place unless we were to just completely withdraw from the Korean Peninsula, which I think would be a strategic mistake. So I think in the military space, it's going to be very hard to calibrate something that would in essence be a concession in North Korea that they would find useful. If anything, we may need to go in the other direction on the military space. So I think that really leaves us then, if engagement isn't terribly valuable, military is really difficult and perhaps unacceptable. It goes back to economic concessions, I think, that will be the things that will potentially carry some weight. And then not just incentives, but also on the other side is to really rebuild the consensus in the international community, and particularly from China, about enforcing sanctions more strongly, and maybe even adding new sanctions if there are new or at least new language to the existing sanctions, new enforcement mechanisms, if North Korea resumes those violations of UN Security Council resolutions. And so the incentive then becomes withholding, though, those measures, which frankly I think are justified already. I mean, North Korea is displaying its violations, like in the picture behind me, to continue to build these systems. Just because it's not testing them doesn't mean that they aren't still flagrantly violating the resolution. So to some extent, being willing to accept incomplete enforcement of sanctions is in that regard, I think, is itself a concession, right? So, but again, we won't know for sure what will satisfy Kim Jong-un until we're engaged in that sort of discussion. It's too hard to say in advance exactly what it's going to be, and I think Kim Jong-un, in his own mind, may not, to be fair, know. And a lot of it too depends on the threshold. Are we talking about stopping all missile testing or just preventing ICBM and nuclear testing? What are we actually asking for? I think it's a process that I'll be interested to see if this approach is pursued. But in the end, there's no silver bullet answer, I think, to this one at all.
North Korea perceives the credibility of potential offers for sanctions relief. One of the things that that is new for the that was new under the Trump administration was the North Korea Sanctions Policy Enhancement Act, which applies sanctions under U.S. law on human rights grounds, in addition to proliferation, right? And so you're complicating the bargain because you're linking those two issues. And so, you know, I don't know, do you think North Korea has enough awareness of the decision making on the US side to make an assessment of how the Biden administration's ability to go to Congress and get sanctions relief without a change in, for example, human rights behavior? Does North Korea understand us well enough to be making those calculations, or is that going to be a potential sticking point on their side for negotiations?
No, certainly, I think North Korea has a habit of holding the United States government at the highest levels responsible for actions, whether they come from the Congress, whether they come from elements of the executive branch simply enforcing the law, that they think, or at least they try to portray that they think that there's some sort of essentially nefarious effort, being coordinated centrally. And certainly, given North Korea's tremendous amount of control of the leader over calibrating his international reactions and posture, military and otherwise, you could see how the North Koreans could mirror image that. However, I don't think this is something that's insurmountable. I think some degree of communication and understanding on the North Koreans' part that the administration can't control everything, I think is going to be it's going to be possible. But in the end, I would have limited expectations that North Korea is going to fundamentally basically, say, oh yeah, it's okay, I understand, Congress is something separate, so you won't be able to fix that. I mean, the North Koreans have even gotten to the point where they blame governments for the actions of private groups and businesses, like the way that the North Koreans have put such pressure on South Korea over the activities of non-government organizations in South Korea, for example, leaflet launches. And then, of course, the way that North Koreans have gone after different countries for being willing to tolerate, say, movies that are critical of the North Korean regime and these sorts of things. There's direct targeting, of course, like in the targeting of Sony over the movie The Interview. But in the end, North Korea does have a tendency to want to try and even hold the governments themselves to account for the behavior of private non-government groups within their countries. So I think this is going to be a recurring problem. And Sheena, I think you're onto something too, in that we're going to have to do something to reconcile the human rights issue with the nuclear issue. I think they're increasingly intertwined, and that ultimately that I don't think you get to a denuclearized North Korea without it being a country that has fundamentally more respect for the human rights of its people. Because then if that doesn't happen, if you don't have that change, then the incentives to give up its nuclear weapons to improve the livelihood of its people are not there, right? So in essence, I don't know how you get to denuclearization without some reform of the North Korean system on human rights grounds.
Historically, right, denuclearization has been very difficult to achieve without some sort of transformation in the nature of the ruling structure, or the identity of the rulers, right, whether it's post-Soviet transitions or the end of apartheid in South Africa, right? Those are two big cases, and both were associated with some sort of regime transformation. I have a bunch more questions about South Korea that I'd love to ask you, but we're running up to the end of our time. Before we close, I did want to ask, I see two questions in the chat that overlap about, any thoughts that you might have or advice you might give about careers in intelligence and defense work, both in government and the private sector. And then a question comes from someone who's an educator of young military intelligence officers, asking, what the biggest takeaways you would want to be relayed to them from today's event.
So, I'll obviously we could give a whole seminar on this sort of advice, but I think one of the most important things to emphasize is the need to build up a good knowledge base, whether you're a military intelligence professional or you desire to be in the national security space or an intelligence officer. You have to build up the framework of both theory and historical knowledge and depth on the issues and regional expertise. And so this sort of foundation is really going to be key if you're seeking to take your analysis to the next level or get opportunities to do that sort of work inside of the government. I think there's a tendency to focus a little bit too much on a particular topic area or developing your expertise just on one particular thing. And so it's great to have depth on a region or on a country and to be able to speak the language very well. But if you don't also have a grounding in larger, issues like, political science, international affairs, strategy, military doctrine, broader diplomatic and military history, and you don't have a track record of really being able to do very rigorous types of analysis and writing and speaking, then I think you're going to be at a disadvantage. It's important to have functional expertise in addition to regional and country expertise. And so being able to speak to things like, from the case of North Korea, having a broader understanding of human rights issues, having a broader understanding of deterrence, proliferation, weapons technology. These are sorts of things that are useful. I'm not saying every functional area that touches North Korea, for example, if you want to focus on North Korea, you have to have that expertise, but it's that nexus oftentimes of having the functional knowledge, the theory and the broader application of an overall issue set combined with knowledge of a particular country or region in the world. I think that's often where you see people have the most value added. But in general, I think the basic idea is to be very well read and very knowledgeable on the theory and the practice and the history in a much broader sense, and be careful not to focus too much on current issues of the day. You definitely want to be knowledgeable, but what I always tell intelligence officers is read less reporting, read more books. And then you'll have the context to be able to put that reporting into place. You want to have that show that depth of knowledge. And again, this is where I definitely align with Sherman Kent, is that you want to have the knowledge and the credibility that comes with that knowledge, and not necessarily just be really up to date on what's going on today. That's important, but that's only one piece of the equation.
Thank you. I think that's those are terrific points for to make as people think about their future careers and their career goals and what skills they really need to be successful and make a contribution. That's very much in keeping with what I think all of us are trying to do when we train students at UT for national security and intelligence and defense related jobs, foreign policy writ large. But I will definitely keep that in mind and relay it to my students, not just this semester, but in the future. For those who are interested, I'm not able to put a link into a chat window for some reason, but the article is now posted on my Twitter feed, which is below. It's below the tweet about the event today. So for those of you who want to see it, you can find it there or on Dr. Garlauskas' Twitter feed as well. And with that, all that remains, apologies to everyone whose questions we didn't get to. We went through as many as we could, but I know there was a long list. I think that's just evidence of how thought-provoking and useful this talk was. So thank you very, very much for joining us today. And I hope we can bring you to UT Austin in person at some point for a redo. But thank you very much for your talk today.
Absolutely. Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Thank you.